In this section, we'll look at civil liberties during World War II. First, it should be noted that while the need for propaganda was not as great in World War II as it was in World War I because of the surprise attack by Japan, the United States did create the Office of War Information. The OWI worked through radio broadcasts, newspapers, posters, and films to ensure that the public maintained support for the war. Among the actors that appeared in patriotic themed movies during the war was future President Ronald Reagan. There were, however, still civil rights violations during World War II. There was, of course, the infamous internment of Japanese Americans. At the time of Pearl Harbor, almost 130,000 Japanese Americans lived in the United States, most in California. Over half were Nisei, or their descendants. Nisei were those Japanese descent born in the U.S. and thus holding U.S. citizenship. Now, everyone feared that the Japanese were going to invade the West Coast. It really was a bit unlikely, but everybody assumed that that was a possibility, and then if it happened, the Nisei would help the Japanese, even though they were U.S. citizens. So in February 1942, FDR issued Executive Order 9066, allowing for the evacuation of those of Japanese descent from a zone across the West. They were placed into camps in California and other western states. Now, these weren't concentration camps, but still, many lost their homes and their jobs. And keep in mind that many were citizens. They should have been protected by the Constitution. In the end, over 110,000 Japanese Americans were moved against their will. In 1944, the Supreme Court even endorsed this internment of Japanese Americans in the infamous case Korematsu versus the United States. It held that the threat was sufficient to warrant a violation of those civil liberties. It was 4 decades later before Americans finally recognized what they did was wrong and issued an apology and gave each survivor reparations. Turning to African Americans served mightily to the war effort, including on the battlefield. Under the Selective Service Act of 1940, more than 3 million African Americans registered for the armed services. A rough estimate of the total number of African Americans in the armed service is about 1 million, which was approximately the ratio of African Americans to the general population in the nation at large. Unlike World War I, they were allowed the Marine Corps and given more meaningful jobs in the Navy. About half of that million served overseas. In Europe, in ground operations, there were 22 black combat units. Included was the 761st Tank Battalion, which was one of the service's most outstanding tank units. All of the African Americans served, however, keep in mind, in segregated units. More than 80 African American pilots won the Distinguished Flying Cross, having destroyed 111 planes in the air and 150 on ground. In any event, you didn't want to be African American and caught by the Nazis. Obviously, they were one of the Untermenschen to the Nazis, the subhumans. Anyway, the most famous group of African American airmen was, of course, the Tuskegee Airmen. African Americans were absolutely critical as well to the domestic production during World War II. Given that many men were out at war, there was a shortage of labor, and this, of course, provided opportunities for African Americans that hadn't existed before, just like it did for women. What you see in World War II, therefore, is the continuation of the Great Migration of African Americans from the rural South to the urban North. Despite the critical importance of African Americans to both the wartime production at home and the military on the battlefield, there was considerable discrimination against African Americans throughout the war. On the home front, African Americans working in defense factories were frequently paid less than the whites doing the exact same job. Moreover, very few of those defense contracts went to African American owned businesses. In the military, as I've said, African Americans served in segregated units, and they had often white commanders. While the percentage of African Americans in the military equaled its percentage in the civilian U.S. population, the percentage of black officers did not. The War Department did try to remedy the situation by sort of a token. It appointed the first African American to the rank of brigadier general, but the African American officers never were proportionate to their population as the white officers were. Also, in 1944, you see an academic study by a Swedish sociologist, Gunnar Myrdal, who published An American Dilemma, The Negro Problem in Modern Democracy. It was published in 1944. It documented for the first time many of the economic inequities that African Americans faced on a daily basis in the United States. Sometimes the African American frustration could boil over. For example, there were several race riots, most notably in Detroit on June 20th, 1943. That riot began with a fistfight between a black man and a white man and spread to several hundred people from both races. The governor was slow to react, and what you end up seeing was you had gangs of white people roaming the street looking for African Americans to beat up. Really, nothing was done until FDR called out the militia at 6,000 strong. In the end, 25 African Americans were dead and about 9 whites died. You also see a civil rights political response as well. In January 1941, A. Philip Randolph, president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, advanced the idea of maybe 50 to 100,000 African Americans marching on Washington if they didn't get equal pay in the defense factories. As preparations began, government officials were worried because obviously the Nazis would love that from a propaganda standpoint. The African Americans complained about their treatment in white America. You're going to see efforts as well to stop the march, because if they didn't work in the factories and they marched on Washington, if there was a massive strike, that would slow the war production. And so you even have Eleanor Roosevelt and New York City Mayor LaGuardia meeting with A. Philip Randolph, trying to get him to call off the march and the strike that would follow. Finally, FDR agreed to meet with Randolph, and they discussed. And what you're going to see is FDR is going to cave. FDR issued Executive Order 8802, which declared, quote, "There shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries and in the government because of race, creed, color, or national origins." It also said it is the duty of employers and labor organizations to provide for full and equitable participation of all workers in defense industries, unquote. What it meant was that if you wanted to get one of the lucrative defense contracts, you had to pay blacks and whites equally. The order also promised that the government would consider African American businesses for the defense contracts. Finally, it created the Fair Employment Practices Commission, the FEPC, to receive complaints and investigate violators. The FEPC had no official power to institute punishment, but it could make recommendations for the cancellation of wartime contracts. A. Philip Randolph, therefore, was an early nonviolent civil rights protester, using the leverage he had during the war. The roots of the nonviolent African American civil rights movement also grew during World War II in other ways. In 1942, James Farmer established the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, and they would demonstrate and have sit-ins. The NAACP grew during the war. It actually grew ninefold, but they often focused on legal strategies, and the CORE was more of an activist thing. As a matter of fact, in 1944, CORE forced several restaurants in Washington, D.C. to serve blacks after picking them with signs that read, "Are you for Hitler's way or are you for the American way? Make up your mind." Also in 1944, the Southern Regional Council was formed. It was a mixture of both blacks and whites, and again, both CORE and the Southern Regional Council would be critical in the civil rights movement after the war. World War II was also a critical period for women. If the roots of the modern African American civil rights movement lay in World War II, the roots of modern American feminism did as well. Women had always worked, but had usually labored in the farm or in traditionally female occupations that paid less, such as like secretaries or elementary school teachers or nurses. Now, given the shortage of labor, however, during the war, the U.S. government needed women to work in its factories, to which many women resisted. They had been enculturated they couldn't do something like that. The government therefore created a campaign to get women to work in industry. It used paintings from the painter Norman Rockwell and created a fictitious laborer named Rosie the Riveter. The campaign worked, and American women were critical to defense production, just like African Americans were. While women were not paid the same as the men doing the exact same job, they were often paid more than before, thus increasing their own economic independence. With the men gone, women learned to take care of all the matters that were necessary from the household, for the household to survive. And after the war, fearing a rise in unemployment, the government ended the Rosie Campaign, and many American women dutifully returned to the home and their traditional jobs. They had not, however, forgotten the independence they had enjoyed and the lessons they had learned during the war. This includes a section on civil liberties during World War II.